I'm white, I'm not English. If you look like me, if you're visibly Jewish, if you have a last name like me, which everyone pretends they can't pronounce or spell, then you're not properly English in the way that someone like Boris Johnson is. And, you know, I don't mind not being English like that, quite honestly. But when I came here, and I've been here many years now, of course, what I get immediately is settler colonial privilege, like it or not. And it has taken years, I think, to fully appreciate the extent of that. And I think we are in a moment now where we are in a Can you hear me? You just said I was muted. Okay, good. Just wanted to check. What I'm going to share with you tonight then is a kind of outline of a book that I wrote on the fellowship that Holly kindly mentioned that I had last year, and with the title that the presentation I have tonight carries. And you know, we've all had a lot of experience of these Zoom presentations now, and I think we know what works better and what doesn't. My sense is that reading a talk is a killer in this format. It's just to have somebody's head down and you don't see their eyes, and it's very easy to drift off to your email or to your social media app. So what I'm really going to offer you here is what I would call a trailer. I'm going to run through the argument of the book. I'm going to show you a lot of images. I'm not going to go into a lot of citational detail and depth of background, but of course we have a question period afterwards. And the benefit of Zoom is we can stay on here as long as we feel like it. No one's going to kick us out of the room, and we can go into this subject in as much depth as you feel comfortable doing. So one of the places that I'd like to start is by thinking about white as a verb. White is originally in English a verb, meaning to make white. And around the middle of the 17th century, it acquired the connotation of racializing. And I'm going to say racializing rather than race, because race does not exist, but making race certainly does. And we see that every day. We live in a moment historically, a very surprising moment perhaps, where the making of whiteness in the sense that can clearly be called white supremacy is once again all around us. Whether we think of Brexit, whether we think of Bolsonaro in Brazil, or we think, of course, of everything that's associated with the word Trump. And it's very clear to me that people didn't expect that or anticipate it. And by all manner of means, I think when I say people, I largely mean white people. We have then some work to do. And the work that I wanted to do is to think, how has that concept of white supremacy survived? Where did it survive? And how has it redeployed itself? And my answer to that question has been twofold. It's been to say that there is a certain way of seeing the world, which I'm calling white sight, which has got nothing to do with how you personally use your individual eyes. An individual doesn't have white sight. A collective does. And that collective is those people who invent themselves under the rubric white people. And that sight is distributed and shared and stored by what I'm going to call the infrastructures of whiteness. And these coalesce in a very familiar form, and a perhaps surprising form, which is to say, the statue. We have, I think, all been surprised to see the extraordinary visibility of statuary and three-dimensional sculptures over the last 5 years. But the fact is they've always been there, hundreds of them, thousands of them. In any big city like New York, where I am, Paris, London, there are hundreds of these statues. And they do work. And I'm going to suggest that there are threefold relationship combined into statues. The statue is a figure of the state. And it is at the same time then, when they combine with each other, they become statute, which is to say law. But that relationship isn't even. It creates static. And the static is the noise of resistance. It's also the noise of deployment of white sight. And it's the place in which contestation happens. And that's where we are in a period of loud static at the moment. So let's begin by looking at some images of sight. I'm going to show you some drawings that demonstrate the understanding of sight are exactly contemporary with that making of the word white into a racializing term around 1649. These are by a French artist called Abraham Boss. Many of you will have seen these. They're often used in art history textbooks, visual culture textbooks. We don't talk about them in the context of whiteness, but we absolutely should. So this is what Boss thinks human seeing is. It's a projection. And so what's happening in this diagram, according to Boss, is that the artist is projecting their vision, which is curved, as you can see here, because, according to Boss, our sight is curved because our eyes are curved. It's a very literal understanding. But it's important then to understand that for him, eyesight is a projection. And of course, you'll see it's a projection onto a taking possession of a feminized body by what we have come to learn as the male gaze. But the male gaze is a figure that's drawn from cinema in the 1950s. It had hundreds of years in settler colonial space, long before the invention of narrative cinema, which is not to criticize Laura Mulvey at all. This projection also has a psychoanalytic meaning that you'll be familiar with, the idea that bad things are pushed out from us onto others. In other words, then the spectator here, who's actually really a projector, is someone who says, I am a good person, and the bad things that exist are out there in the world. This projected sight is combined in Boss's view with something that comes in or introjected, which is what we call perspective. And for Boss, perspective was the system that controlled everything in visual representation. Appearance, portraiture, landscape, everything to him was controlled by perspective. And this drawing is everywhere. It's in my visual culture books, it's in everybody's. And we've never really seen what's going on here, which is the control and deployment of whiteness. These are white figures in white space. And from their eyes come these lines that demarcate and claim a space that will now be erased. Any indigenous or other than human presence is erased, and that land is then claimed. These people are soldiers. You can see that they're carrying swords, and there are 3 of them. And I take them to stand for racializing, for gendering, and for the figure of the aesthetic in a very particular sense. The aesthetic here being what Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and revolutionary, described as the aesthetic of respect for the established order. So what does that mean? It means flags, it means uniforms, it means not crossing the road against the traffic light. It means thinking that the way that things are organized is the appropriate way that they should be organized. And that when people disrupt that sense of respect, a great wave of outrage will often follow. So for example, if a football player takes a knee when the national anthem is played, this is a fairly modest gesture of protest, but it has created waves of fury around the world, in Europe as much as it has in the United States. And because people perceive it as a challenge to the established order, which is to say, to white supremacy. So when we're thinking about this infrastructure of white sight, we need to understand that it takes place as an intersection of a form of vision that is projected and one that comes in to the body, and that therefore it is always unstable. And then there's an attempt to make it stable through the figure of the statue and through the statue figure. So that then there is then, as I said, this relationship between the state and the statue and the law that comes from the state. And I began to think about this very closely in 2020, during the George Floyd uprising. The Black British artist Isaac Julian made some of his artwork available free by streaming. And I watched his film Baltimore on that stream. And this is normally a 3-screen projection, but he made a 1-screen version. And during that, you have this moment where the film director Marvin Van Peebles, who just recently became an ancestor, is seen looking at a painting in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, painting that, again, many of you will be familiar with from your art history courses, that depicts the ideal city. And this is often used as a demonstration of, again, perspective. But Julian's structure here is clearly designed to make us think about whose perspective is it? Is it a perspective that belongs to all, or is it an exclusionary and exclusive form? The Walters during 2020 was the subject of some quite striking surveillance by the Baltimore Police Department, and local activists measured the flights of drones that went around this, as you can see, circular space in Baltimore, which is exactly equivalent with the area where people protested during the uprising after the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. So the museum is literally central to this regime of surveillance, both highly contemporary in the drone form, and make a mental note because we will come back to this later, and in its very traditional form through one point perspective that's preserved inside the museum. And here you can see that painting in greater detail. These paintings are actually quite poorly known in the sense that we have attributions to all of the artists, but none of them are definite. We don't really know exactly when they were painted. We don't really know exactly what city they represent, but they very clearly represent a view of the world that's organized around a vanishing point to a particular single spectator, but also one in which commercial wealth is generating revenue. There's a warehouse in the background that you can see, and that the public space is monitored by these 4 statues on pillars, one of which is the statue of abundance, which replaced the traditional ancient Greek deity of happiness, because we are already in the regime that African-American historian Cedric J. Robinson called racial capital. Capital is being assembled here, and it is being done so in a way that is always and already colonial, but Europe has already begun to expand. This becomes very visible in the final painting of the 3-panel series. This is one, we call it the Berlin panel because that's where it is now. And you can see it's more of an architectural design. What I want you to look at is in the background here, the harbor. And these ships that you can see in the harbor here are not ships that are designed to sail in the Mediterranean, where they mostly used galleys powered by oars, but these are ships that are designed to go down the coast of Africa and later across the Atlantic. In other words, the ideal city sequence, and there are 3 of them, begins in the city state, but it ends, as it were, the vanishing point here is the horizon towards colonization. And there are 2 points in the ocean out there, the Mediterranean. One is called Capraia, which is an island that's off the city of Livorno, which we'll come back to in a moment. And the second one is a mythical island. It's called Gorgon, and it's supposedly where the Gorgon lived. You remember the Gorgon turns people into stone by her gaze. She makes statues. So we will have 2 destinations here. We'll have the statue destination and we'll have the geometric destination. So I'm first going to go to Livorno, which is on the Tuscan coast. And because the city of Genoa was silting up, the Medici in the early 17th century decided to create a new port here. And they built a version of an ideal city. And this was done by Ferdinando de' Medici. And his function in creating this city was to make it a colonial port. He hoped to trade directly with Brazil. He sent a colonial expedition to Brazil. They didn't actually get there. They landed in French Guiana. They brought a few Kalinago, which is to say Caribs, back to Tuscany. 5 of them died almost immediately. 1 of them continued to live at the Medici court. We don't know their name. Here, Ferdinando is standing looking out to sea, very classic colonial pose. If you're standing in the square, you can see him looking out to sea. This isn't, but the statue wasn't actually put up until 20 years after it was made. And it went up in the 1620s at a moment where statuary is changing. Again, you'll be very familiar with this image, but I want to suggest it in a slightly different way. Bernini's Apollo and Daphne shows the metamorphosis that is taking place, taken from Ovid, the Roman poet. Violence here is being transformed into value. Apollo's intent here is quite clear. He intends to rape Daphne. And even when she gets turned into a tree, and you can see that happening even as we look at the statue, he did continue to assault her. And that metaphor lingers in our practice and our language. Every time we can say to someone, you won your laurels, or every time we talk about someone having won a victory laurel, we are memorializing Apollo's assault on Daphne. And we'll come back to Apollo. He'll lose the visible figure of Daphne, but he is always in this moment of transforming a body into value. And that is, of course, precisely what settler colonial slavery does. It takes human life, it uses violence, and it turns it into value in small islands, like beginning with Madeira, which is a Portuguese island, and then moving into the Caribbean, Barbados, and later Saint-Domingue, that becomes Haiti, are the most wealth-generating spots on the face of the planet in the 17th and 18th centuries, despite being tiny little islands, because human labor is converted into value by means of violence. When that comes back to Livorno, at the same time, these statues were added to the base of the statue of Ferdinando that I showed you before. They're called the Four Moors, Moor being a euphemism for North African. And you can see that there are visible portraits of actually existing human beings. And indeed, Livorno was organized, its ideal city was organized around a slave prison, which is just to the right of where we're looking here, called the Bagno. And these people that we're seeing here would have lived in there, and they were so visibly recognizable to the Italian population, to use an anachronistic term, of the city, that they weren't kept restrained because everybody knew that they were enslaved. In particular, these two individuals, Ali on the left and Modiano on the right, are known to have actually, these are real people. Ferdinand Pietro Tacca, who was the sculptor that made these images, was believed at one point to have used human casts to make them, but as you can see, the statues are a little larger than life size. He may have done that in some way to give him the sense. But these are recognizable human beings. They are restrained, they are thin, they are literally chained up. So what I want us to do is, every time you see a monument, every time you see a statue, you should know that the white imaginary thinks that at the base of that statue, there are human beings chained up whose value will be converted into, who by violence, their labor will be converted into value. Excuse me, I stumbled over my words there. What happens, of course, is that symbol condenses. That's what symbols do. They become simpler and easier to understand, but they're always there. And so here you see the full drama of urban city space metamorphosing into white space. That statue takes on totally different resonance when you see it, I think, with the figures of the enslaved at the base, looking out to sea, looking towards the imaginary colonial empire that the Medicis imagine they're going to build. So now I'm going to cross the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, to the plantation and look at Whiteside in action. Whiteside is mobilized by a figure who in English is called the overseer, so that you couldn't get a more precise equivalence between the work of whiteness, the work of seeing, and the domination of the plantation. The overseer is this figure in the middle here. And you can see that we can't really see him. We don't really see his face. What we see is his act of seeing enslaved African labor. What they're doing here is they're making indigo. Indigo is the blue dye that makes jeans blue. So we still live in this world. We may not be extracting indigo in the same way, but it's conceptually the same world. You'll notice too that there's a division of labor going on here. There are 14 steps to make indigo. In other words, we're already in not just a plantation economy, but a factory economy, the division of labor. And we are in a world where skill is required. Making indigo is difficult. There's a lot of skill involved, as much as there is also spectacular violence on the plantation, and the overseer is visualized here with his cane, and he's posing with it as if he was some kind of a dandy, but that's actually a specialized kind of stick that the overseers had to hit people with. And of course, we know that they did do that. So what I've done with some sort of fairly amateur photoshopping is to combine Abraham Boss's perspective with the gaze of the overseer here, to give you the sense then of a narrow window on the world that perspective is, being focused on the process of the metamorphosis of life into value by means of violence. There is a space outside of that sight, a lot of it, as you can see. It's not always possible then for oversight to control all the space around it. And again, in English, the word oversight has a double meaning because it can mean mistaking or not seeing things correctly or not picking them up, as much as it can mean supervision. So there is always resistance. There's always a space for resistance, and there's always a place for it. This whiteness then, the figure there of the overseer, as you see him here, becomes a statue. So if the imaginary representation of the overseer in that 17th century print for planters that I showed you before becomes a physical statue, primarily in the European world and later in the Americas, especially after the successful revolution of the enslaved that forms the nation of Haiti in 1791 and afterwards. And almost immediately that happens, Europeans start to theorize a different understanding of the nature of our species, that there are in fact multiple human species and that they are radically distinct, and that whites are at the top of that pyramidical form and that others are below them. And I'm showing you on the left-hand side of the screen, as you look here, a drawing that has long outlived the very dull book in which it was enshrined by a man called Virey, V-I-R-E-Y. Very few people have read that book. I'm unfortunately one of them, but many people have seen this image because it has its life of its own. It circulates around the internet now. It has circulated in prints, drawings, and other representational forms around the world in the 200 years since it was made in 1801. And what we have here is on the top, the idea of the dominant form of the human being the white person, but not represented by an individual person, but by the Apollo Belvedere, the Roman copy of a Greek sculpture that's currently in the Vatican, but was at the time that Virey made this print in the Louvre because Napoleon had looted it from the Vatican and brought it back with him after his Italian campaign. So I used to think that there was something almost amusing about this idea that you couldn't find any white person that was white enough to be the model for white people. But actually, this is part of the theory of whiteness, that in the ancient Greek period, humans were properly white. And then through what they use various euphemisms, amalgamation. In other words, through people having children with people of different ethnicities and backgrounds, that whiteness becomes blurred in the actual human body. But the statue then remains and is the only perfect form of whiteness. And it can be seen, and humans can be measured against it. And below them on this scale are, in this space, there would have been a caricature of an African. And again, without trying to conceal the fact, I have erased it because I see no particular reason to circulate racist caricatures. And we all know what these look like. And there's nothing to be learned from seeing it. I think it does more harm to put these things into mental circulation. I cannot stop you from registering that image because these images go with the grain of white supremacy. And our eyes are trained to see them and to store them and to keep them. So I'm choosing in the work that I'm doing now around whiteness not to show racist caricatures alongside of images of whiteness, to make those of us who are, like it or not, identified as white, confront only the images of whiteness and not to allow ourselves the kind of escape, if you like, of thinking through the racial oppression of others. On the bottom, and with due apologies to Simeon's, is at least in theory a drawing of an orangutan. Now, you may mistake this from retrospective vision as an evolutionary drawing, and it's not. It's important to say that. The idea is that these are steps in different species altogether. There's not supposed to be any kind of change. So this is the idea then that the statue represents the static nature of humanity, that there has been and there will be no change in the way that human bodies are formed, and that the bodies that are identified as white and bodies that are identified as African have been, always will be, radically distinct. And this is a long-lasting visual form. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you Viré's later theory of the statue of the Apollo Belvedere as having within it a skull. And so he's drawn here, or had drawn for him, what he imagines the skull of the Apollo Belvedere to have been like. Now, so if we have a statue that isn't a person, now we have a skull of a statue that isn't a person, that obviously didn't have a skull. And nonetheless, this is an extraordinarily influential visual form. The idea that the best kind of skull to have is one that is long and has a straight forehead is clearly visualized here, in the statue that I'm showing you here, the head of Theodore Roosevelt, that is still outside the American Museum of Natural History a few miles to the north of me here. If you open almost any copy of GQ magazine or anywhere else where you see male models, you'll see this kind of rugged masculinity, the idea that the big straight head is the better head. Or if you use the language of highbrow, middle brow, or low brow, you're also talking in terms that 19th century racialized theory would understand, that the statue is the model, not an example of, but the very form that whiteness takes. So I'm going to move into a second modality here, which is to think of, this will be another chapter in the book, to think about how in the age of empire, which is to say in the middle 19th to middle 20th centuries, the narrow window on the world that was offered to people using the form of perspective radically expanded into an imperial vision that claimed to see everything through a kind of screen view of the world. And this was, again, though, a way of seeing that was always hesitant, always nervous about the possibility of revolution or uprising. So I'm showing you here a perspective that was drawn by the British critic John Ruskin in a text for artists published in 1859. Now, this is 2 years after an event that resonated around the British Empire, which is known in India as the First Indian Revolution and in Britain as the Indian Mutiny, which tells you something. That took place, as I say, in 1857. It was the first major uprising of the colonized in England's largest colony in the subcontinent of India. The British didn't see it coming, and they drew several consequences from this. They couldn't understand how the European had lost their privileges and their status in India, and how now there seemed to be this kind of wall between the Indian and the colonizer. And Ruskin imagines a visual answer to that in the manner prescribed, as it were, by William Blake a few years before, in which he had said, art follows empire, not the other way around, as Englishmen presume. In other words, it's art that tells empire how to see things. And here, his perspectival viewpoint that you can see is strikingly like what we will also see as a kind of target or a rifle sight later. What Ruskin imagines is that the artist creates, or a human indeed, imagines the world as having an enormous sheet of glass in front of them, a mile long and a mile high. This sheet of glass is perfectly thin, so there's no refraction and no reflection. And the artist can use this sight point anywhere on this gigantic sheet of glass to represent the world outside them. But that sheet radically divides the colonizer from the colonized, the white person from the person of color. And it provides a kind of space, a space of observation, if you like, in this rather peculiar way. Ruskin will then later go on in his lectures on art that were given at Oxford University in 1871, reprinted thousands of times, to argue that the child of an educated race, meaning the English, has an innate instinct for beauty. As a result, England must do this or perish. They must found colonies as fast and far as she is able, formed of her most energetic and worthiest men. In other words, then, colonizing is now almost a biological activity. You have to do it, or else you will perish, you'll die. England has to continue this expansion, or else it won't continue to be England. And Ruskin prescribes to artists certain forms of work that they should do that are properly imperial: portraiture, a landscape, and the paintings of animals. In other words, he comes pretty close to imagining a kind of what you might call imperial Instagram, with certain subjects, but not grand historical subjects, because the grand history is happening all around you. You're doing that. You're making these colonies. What this might be imagined to look like is twofold. On the one hand, looking at the world through a screen gives you an enormous, as it were, protection from it. That projection that we talked about before. Here, for example, is a colonial battle fought by the English in modern-day Sudan at a place called Omdurman, in which, in a matter of minutes, 11,000 people were killed, 16,000 were wounded, of whom many were later executed by the British using machine guns, which they had at this time. On the British side, 42 people were killed. So it's an enormous disparity. It's almost like nothing has happened to you, and this is calamity has happened on the other side. So that you see the world as something that you look at through the sight point. It's a rifle point or a rifle target, and you fire without compunction. This is visualized in domestic circumstances through a very similar construction. This is the first diorama that was created in the American Museum of Natural History of wading birds, made in 1909. And it has some of the same concerns that Ruskin had. There's a large sheet of glass. It's posed in such a way that it doesn't make reflections. As you can see, I'm able to stand in front of it and photograph it here without you seeing my reflection in the glass. This is one of the reasons the museum says they can't change anything in the museum, because everything's so expensive. So if you break the glass, it can't be replaced. And there are all these animal forms inside. It's very crowded, it's very dramatic. But the point of what's happening here is that it was believed at this time that the wading birds that were being seen here were likely to go extinct, and that the American Museum was collecting them in order to show to future generations of Americans species that were believed likely to have been made extinct by human hunting for the most part. So they're not trying to really stop the hunting, they're trying to collect specimens so that they can show to the world what will have been erased from it by the actions of settler colonialism. So these ways of seeing have extremely practical applications. I can talk, I'm keeping an eye on the time, but the American Museum of Natural History played and continues to play a very significant role in public education, not just in New York City, where then and now hundreds of thousands of school children visit every year, but as a model for American, not just museums, but for education as such, which was called in the early 20th century, the new museum idea. And the new museum idea was to educate people visually. And so it is directly connected with visual culture and with the idea then of white sight. Towards the end of the high imperial moment, a group of people in Britain took it upon themselves to see exactly what this meant, this idea of seeing the world through a sheet of glass, and to break it in the claim to rights. These are people who we know as the suffragettes, who launched a major window breaking campaign around Britain in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the beginning in 1909, and then later a major day of action in March of 2012, where over 400 windows were broken all around London in a single day. Women described going to a particular, they'd be taken to a restaurant or other public space, and they would be asked what kind of prison sentence they felt capable of doing. And in response to that, they would be allocated a particular target. They were given specific hammers with labels, and the windows would then be targeted and broken. The suffragettes, I think, through this symbolic action, demonstrated their understanding and their awareness of the way in which heteropatriarchy was separating them from the world and keeping them on one side of that crystal plate, as Ruskin called it. And they were literally breaking the window to let themselves in, as it were. And they were to step this campaign up with the attacks on paintings that took place in 1913 and 14. And it was only then, with the outbreak of the First World War, just a few weeks after a suffragette called Margaret Gibb had cut the painting of Thomas Carlyle in the National Portrait Gallery, London, that this campaign came to an end, because Europe had now turned its own colonizing techniques on itself. The kind of massacres that we saw at Omdurman in 1898 were routine, daily occurrences on the Western Front. And the giant sheet of glass, if you like, between Europe and its others was comprehensively broken by the First World War, leading Freud, amongst others, to discover what he calls, or to invent, what he called the death drive, the idea that behind that glass, once you get through on the other side, you find that, in fact, you're not as in charge as you thought. You have this compulsion to repeat. You are traumatized. You cannot direct your attention in the way that you had previously thought. In the long confusions that follow, I want to just quickly show you how London was changed by this. So in the late 1890s, Oscar Wilde and his friends sort of imagined a kind of alternative London that they could use as what they called a dream city that was mostly out here in the East End. Places like Holywell Lane, where you could buy pornography of what was 19th century pornography. And it was ringed by prisons. Here, Pentonville Prison, this is where Wilde was imprisoned. And this is Holloway Prison, where Sylvia Pankhurst was imprisoned when she broke a window deliberately in 1912. And she broke the window here in East London, in Bow. And 6 times while she was in prison, people marched from Bow to Holloway. It's about 6 miles down this route. And they're bringing then the excluded world of East London, of immigrants, of marginalized working class, across central London to the carceral world of the prison, breaking that frame. After the Second World War, with the beginnings of the end of colonization, with the movement to decolonizing, the phrase way of seeing came into being. All of us know this term if you work in the field of visual culture, and we all tend to attribute it to John Berger, but we're wrong. It was actually coined by the man that you can see on the left here, George Lamming, who was a poet from Barbados, and he spent the 1950s and 60s, as he called it, in exile in London. And in a book that he published in 1960 called Pleasures of Exile, he first uses this important term, way of seeing. Lamming was close friends with C.L.R. James, who was the historian of Haiti, who had published The Black Jacobins in Britain in 1938, and it would be republished in a second edition also in London in 1963, just after Lamming's book. So they're in dialogue about the history of the Caribbean, about its revolutionary past and possibilities of its decolonial future. Many of the Caribbean islands, most of them, are still colonies at the time that they were having these conversations. But Lamming came to this realization when he went to a poetry reading at the new Institute for Contemporary Art that was opened in London in 1951. And when he gets up to read, the whole room broke into applause before he'd said anything. And he said, okay, I've been seen. He knew that that was an applause then because people recognized a visual distinction between them and him as a Caribbean poet. And he got no questions about his poetry after he read it. But that wasn't what he meant by the full way of seeing. What happened next was that this poet, now forgotten East End Jewish radical man called Emanuel Litvinov, who was a minor poet in 1950s and 60s and later became a novelist, got up and read his own poem, which is this one, called To T.S. Eliot. What happened was that Litvinov, who as I say is a Jewish radical, became aware that Eliot had reprinted his selected poems in a paperback form, the one that I'm showing you here, in 1950, including some of his earlier anti-Semitic poems from the 1920s and 30s, Bleistien and their like. And he felt this was unacceptable after the Holocaust, after everything that was known. And so he wrote this poem, which you're welcome to read off the screen as I talk, criticizing Eliot for this. And it turned out that as he read it, he became aware that Eliot was in fact in the room, in this space that's devoted to the contemporary. But it is nonetheless, as it were, a kind of temple of high culture, poetry, art, and so on. And Lamming watches this, and he watches as Litvinov concludes, one poet after another jumps up in the audience and criticizes Litvinov, Herbert Reed, who's the chair of the ICA, who's an anarchist, who said he had known that Litvinov was going to do this, he would never have invited him. Stephen Spender claimed to be partly Jewish and got up and said that again, Eliot was entirely innocent and blameless and Litvinov was a terrible person. And as he watched this, Lamming said, and now I see how the way of seeing operates. In other words, he sees them seeing another other, and he realizes how he is seen reflexively by example. He can't absorb that if it's happening to him, but he can see it happening to others. And he later, when he writes about it, he connects the high cultural violence, if you like, which is not a physical violence, that goes on in the Institute of Contemporary Art with the actual street violence that took place in the Notting Hill district of London in 1958 and 1959, leading to the murder of a man called Kelso Cochrane on the street in London. And he says the ACA became the neighbor of Notting Hill. In other words, then, the way of seeing is a way of realizing what we spoke about way back in the Renaissance at the beginning of this talk, the idea of the implication of violence in high culture and its acting out, whether it's in the plantation or in the working class suburbs of London, as Notting Hill was at that time. Of course, now it's a very fancy neighborhood. When Lamming published this work, a group of immigrants and thinkers were working around this idea of the new visuality that was apparent in Notting Hill, including the young Stuart Hall, who I'm showing you here in the Partisan Cafe in Soho. And for Hall, the violence in Notting Hill revealed the unmistakable profile of Britain's colonial policy over the last century. Now, he's writing that in 1958, so that goes right the way back then to the Indian uprising of 1857 that Ruskin had intervened to create the imperial viewpoint. So we are now then in a space where, in this moment of decolonizing, the imperial screen largely broken, how will we be able to see going forward? Lamming and others create this decolonizing way of seeing in the space of Notting Hill engaging with and thinking through the practices of racializing violence that are taking place on the street. Just to give you one example, key example, I think, this is the work of a British photographer called Roger Mayne, who also took this photo of Stuart that I showed you a moment ago, M-A-Y-N-E. And this is one of his series of photographs that he took in a particular street in London called Southam Street, which is in Notting Hill. It was on the corner of this street that Kelso Cochrane was killed a few years after this picture was taken in 1959. And it was on that same street corner that the British fascist Oswald Mosley held a rally the year after that when he ran for parliament in this district. He didn't succeed, but his slogan, "Keep Britain White," has stayed in power, if you like, in Britain very much since. And Brexit is nothing if not a movement to keep Britain white. Here then you can see the operations of the way of seeing. The West Indian men are walking in a group through the street. No less than 4 young white children are staring blatantly at them. And this is an enactment of the scene that Frantz Fanon has just described in his book that was published 4 years before this photograph was taken, in which he describes a young white child saying to his mother, "Look, Mama, a Negro," in which he doesn't respond. The child says it over and over again until he finally gets the attention of his mother, and Fanon is reduced to embarrassment, laughter, and anxiety by this statement. The men here are not concerned with the look of the children. They're doing 2 ways of seeing. One is they are doing this long stare down the street. They are aware of any potential threat in front of them, but they're also issuing a visual challenge. Are you willing to engage with us? The man at the back here has spotted Roger Mayne, and he's looking at him carefully to see, what are you doing? What is the nature of the work that you're engaged in here? These young white men that we see over here are dressed in a uniform that I have identified them at the time as TEDs. TEDs is short for Edwardian. They were a kind of youth hooligan group, one of the first kind of subcultural violent white groups that rose up in Britain in the 1950s. And they're identified by these black jackets and white shirts. They're very carefully not catching the eye of the West Indian men. On Southam Street, as common throughout working class London, if you did catch someone's eye, then there would have to be an exchange, a challenge. Who are you looking at? And then that could very well then lead to subsequent physical violence. So this photograph, completely enclosed in visual terms, there's no way out visually. You're locked onto this street. The windows that you can see are covered in curtains. The doors are closed. This is then a space of confrontation. This is the less than ideal city that is changing from being an imperial capital, as London had been up until 1945, into what it would become, which is one of the 2 capitals of financial globalization, as it has been since the beginnings of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 90s, and remains. New York and London remain the 2 most financialized, globalized cities, according to financial metrics. This then is the set of tensions and interactions that creates the way of seeing, and that from which the field that I work in, the field of visual culture, should, I would argue, claim and think about its intellectual origins. In our own time, we have seen a return to what I would call warsight. And this is surprising that the imperial view of the world that claimed this far-reaching gaze has again become very narrow and very focused. This is actually an ad. It's an ad for a very early kind of drone that was made by the Israeli Defense Force in the 1980s. And this appears in an aviation weekly. And you can see that the drone has on the ground a series of patches of white space that it can see. And if you remember back to the second image that I showed you this evening of the perspective, we have exactly the same visual form, a series of pyramidical linear visualizings of space on the ground. The difference here being that you're not just claiming to own that space, but this is a space in which now, of course, you can see people and you can kill them. And this is actually the legal and technical military name of these spaces. They are called kill boxes. You can download a manual off the internet. The US Army has issued a series of bureaucratic regulations about the operation of the kill box, but it means what it says. The kill box is a box that the drone can see, and in that space, they can kill people. Up to, there can be limits of height here. That's what the blue kill box is, a three-dimensional one, so that you can fly things above that height and not be targeted by the drone, for example. But nonetheless, we have then this very specific return to a kind of highly focused, but highly deadly, mechanized form of seeing. This has reached an interesting and I think, frankly, quite scary apogee in recent times. Last year in Libya, these little drones were flying. They're called Cargo 2s. They're cheap. They're made in Turkey. And the way that they work is they see their target, as you can see here, in a way that Ruskin would have understood, but is the narrow viewpoint from Boss. And what they are what you would call suicide drones. The way that they attack is they throw themselves into the target and then they explode. What happened in Libya last year was that they started to take autonomous decisions about whether to attack targets independently of their operators elsewhere. So that we tend to think of the drone as simply an extension of man in the way that Marshall McLuhan defines media. But these machines have taken on their own decision-making capacity now. Now, we've seen this movie and we know how it ends. And we should, I think, all be kind of nervous about where this goes, because this is a very cheap and fairly unimportant form of drone. What happens if a Hellfire Predator or a Reaper or a Gorgon Stare, which are the more powerful American drones, goes autonomous? Could be, to say the least, somewhat interesting. But I want to end on that down note. I want to end on the sense that I think we are in a moment where it is in fact possible to unbuild white sight. I'm taking this metaphor from the architect Mabel Wilson, who had a show called Reconstructions at the Museum of Modern Art in 2021. And that's what she's talking about, unbuilding racial supremacy. And whiteness is, of course, a clear part of that. So rather than the metaphors that were used in early white studies of being a traitor to whiteness or trying to kill it, those are operations of the nation state. And even if I sympathize with the end, I don't sympathize with the means. I want to take this thing down in the way that we have seen, right? In 2016, I answered a question that was made into a meme by Liberate Tate, who are the group who protest fossil fuel sponsorship of British museums. I want an institution, museum or gallery, whatever, that doesn't reproduce white supremacy. What would that look like? So in 2016, we didn't really even yet quite know. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time because I know I'm a little bit behind time. That same year, at the Standing Rock protests, the indigenous who gathered to defend the water in Osity-Sakoin gave us a methodology. If you want to approach, you want to participate along with the indigenous in the defense of the water, you must know that this is a ceremony. You must act accordingly. In other words, there are no rules. You must listen, you must learn, you follow, you stand back, you don't put yourself at the front, you don't make dramatic actions, you unbuild rather than demolish, and you learn. Here we're seeing veterans of the United States Army apologizing to Leonard Crodog, who was a Oglala Sioux leader. And a year later, as following the events at Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally, we began to see holes appearing in white space. Here's where Lee used to stand looking out to sea in the same way as the statue of Ferdinando de' Medici looks out to sea. He was taken down in 2017 and a hole is opened. We saw a different kind of memorial created in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. An autonomous citizen-directed memorial that was approved by the family and used at George Floyd's funeral, even though the artists concerned were not themselves of African descent. The assemblages around the mural were taken down by Minneapolis City Council. Perhaps that's not, in the end, the worst thing. Perhaps we no longer want to make memorials and monuments that last forever. We have taken to rewriting white site. On the top of this monument, which you can't see here, is the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, which was removed earlier this year. But people came into that space long before and they rewrote these monuments. They claimed them, they tagged them, they colorized them. And even if that statue was still in place, which thankfully it's not, it no longer conveys the same message. It no longer dominates the space in the way that it had previously sought to do. And it previously had literally towered over any person that might walk past on Monument Avenue. I call these actions together the human strike. And I take this from the artist Claire Fontaine, who they're actually a collective. They work together. The human strike isn't a labor strike. It isn't a withdrawal of labor, but it is in this case, a strike against whiteness. Like Bartleby, the copyist in a Wall Street office in the 19th century, when we are asked to reproduce whiteness, we should say, I would prefer not to. And then we can begin to answer Claire Fontaine's question, how do we become something other than we are? What would that look like? It will begin with certain gestures of refusal. It will begin with not reproducing the statue form. It will begin by amplifying the static so that they can no longer be heard. And it will be done as a feminist strike, as Veronica Gago and the Argentinian movement have taught us, under hashtag the desire to change everything. That is the small goal that is ahead of us. But we have actually learned in this past 5 years some of the tools by which we might do that. And we find ourselves, I think, in a position where the unbuilding of whiteness is not a utopian dream, but a practical task that each of us, whether a critic, art maker, person who has nothing to do with academia whatsoever, can engage in our daily lives. Thank you for listening to me. I know I went on a little longer than I intended, but I hope that you have time to stick around and we can maybe have a little discussion and think about the issues that I raised.
Thank you so much. I'm on a different computer screen because mine, of course, ended up having some technical difficulties. So I'm over here instead. But thank you so much. We put in the chat earlier, Melissa suggested anyone if they wanted to put any questions in the chat, but please feel free if anyone has any questions, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourselves. If you prefer to put a question in the chat and have it read out, you can go ahead and raise your hand on the Zoom feature, whatever you'd prefer to do, but feel free to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Ken.
Okay. Good night, everybody. It was a great pleasure to hear what you have researched for, I imagine, for a while. And I never thought about this type of whiteness vision that coming from above and I found it very surprising and interesting. And can I ask you, how did you start this research? How did you come up with this idea?
Sure, no, that's a good question actually, because people often do ask me that, and I think in a field that's relatively new, we often want to say, how does work like that happen? And in the past, when people ask me questions like that, I often go off in these long theoretical detours, and people say, no, I don't mean that. I mean, what did you actually do?
Yes.
So I can give you a quite precise answer in this case, actually. So what happened was that if you remember in 2014, Michael Brown and Eric Garner were killed, and the Black Lives Matter movement began at that time. And what I was doing at that time was essentially being a follower, quite literally, in a way that I was telling people that we might do a moment ago, in that, you know, I would go to a march or an event, and the people of African descent and indigenous folks and whatever would be at the front, and we would follow. And that's all that I was doing through the fall of 2014. And then I will remember the moment in November of 2014 when the Attorney General in Missouri gets up and said he had no true bill to bring against Darren Wilson, who was the man, police officer then, who had killed Michael Brown. But he was so confident in everybody agreeing with us, he took an extraordinary step. He released all the legal materials and the transcripts to the grand jury of the killing of Michael Brown. Now, this never normally happens. Grand juries meet in secret, and that's one of their hallmarks, if you like. And, you know, I remember, and he's very smug about it. And he says, no one's ever going to read all of this. And I took that as a challenge. And so I did. I read it all. And I came up with a very different version of what had happened. And we put this on the internet in a magazine that we had that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. It was called Tidal, but unfortunately Jay-Z owns that name now. It went, as we used to say before the pandemic, viral, and sort of 100,000 people saw it on the first day and so on. And something kind of odd happened, which was, this is supposed to, I mean, what I'm doing at that point is being an activist. But what actually then happened was that universities and art schools and all kinds of places started inviting me to come to talk at their institutions around Black Lives Matter. And at that stage in the movement, it felt important that to just get the word out as much as you could. But one of the things that happened during those visits was I would go to the places and I would see that almost all my audience were white people. And so it became clear to me that what I was doing was talking about my impression of Black Lives Matter as a white person to other white people to try and kind of translate it for them and help us understand it. And it started to become clear to me that we really needed to think about this in ways of, what are we saying? What are we not talking about? And it was clear to me that we were not sufficiently talking about how we were constructed as white people. And I paused at that point, to be honest with you, because, you know, there has been a whiteness studies academic field since the 1990s. And Richard Dyer, who was one of my advisors at the University of Warwick, wrote this famous book called White that came out in 1997. And one of the claims that he makes in that book is that he wants to help people to see white. When Charlottesville happened in 2017, I thought, you know what, you don't need to do that anymore. It's out there, you can see it. It's not difficult to perceive this. At the same time as realizing, hang on, these monumental statues, these are doing work that we hadn't thought they were doing. They're doing work not just individually, but collectively. They're doing work as what, and this is where I brought in the idea for media studies of infrastructure. The idea that they formed a collective infrastructure. And once I started putting that pieced together, then I realized that there were many things that I had thought about over the years adjacently to this area, that if you align them up, they make the argument that I've just outlined to you. In other words, I think this is all around us. You know, it's not something that one has to discover or to do a field trip to find out where it is. It's everywhere that we go. And the question is more one of then thinking about how one might evaluate it. And the context of the George Floyd uprising was the perfect context in which to do that, because it became vitally necessary to do that. And in that moment, people were very much being asked, and I think are still being asked, to do the work where they are. And I think this is how activists always suggest that we should do the work. In other words, rather than going someplace else because you think their cause is more sexy or more appealing or more fun than the one that you have, we have to deal with this. This is our business. And this is what Black Lives Matter activists have said to us. This is your work. You have to do this. Specifically in the case of the top-down viewpoint, I'd actually, long ago, in my PhD dissertation, I had written about Abraham Buss, the perspectivist that I mentioned here, and we'd all written about him in the visual culture texts of the 1990s and early 2000s, and it just came to mind. I mean, I just thought, hang on a minute, look at this from the perspective of the 2020 moment. And it's not just a drawing with lines, it's a drawing about whiteness, and they're looking down, literally, they're looking down on this and they're carrying swords. And then you start to see them as cops. And once you do that, then you're in a very different intellectual space and you start to be able to make these connections.
Thank you so much. That's genius, Dr. Mirzoeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I really appreciate it.
I'll ask a question. It's a very specific question, I think.
Okay.
I was stunned a bit when you were talking about the diorama at the American Museum of Natural History. And did I hear you correctly that they said they couldn't change anything because it would cost too much money?
Yes, you did. You absolutely did.
That just blew my mind. And I thought to myself, well, then are they doing anything else in order to decolonize their methods in the museum and practices? Because there's so much they could do, but with an attitude like that, it just felt, I don't have a whole lot of hope.
This goes to Rochelle's question a moment ago as well, Melissa, because in the first round of Black Lives Matter movement, a group of activists organized what they called a blackout tour at the American Museum of Natural History in 2015. And we went on this, it was in January, I remember. And I have written about the American Museum of Natural History in a book that I published in 1995 called Bodyscape. And it was about the expedition that the museum sent to the then Belgian Congo, and they literally extracted tons of cultural artifacts from the Congo. The American Museum of Natural History, parenthetically, holds 36,000 objects of African origin. It's a museum of natural history. What are they doing there? It holds, including some of the so-called Benin bronzes that are in the museum. And my reaction was one that was also, the anthropologist Emily Martin has written an essay about this, and it's the same reaction, like you go back to the museum and think, hang on, nothing has changed. And it's in her article that she went to the museum and made a very well-informed argument for changing some of the displays in the Hall of African Peoples, which still exists and is a monstrosity. And this is what they said to her. They said, well, we can't. It's too expensive. Once you break the glass, it costs $100,000 because there's a vacuum in there, and this is very special glass, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, what is your priority here?
Yeah.
You know, what is your priority here? And as you walk through the American Museum, you'll see, and I do this sometimes with my students, I take them around and show them the name of the Sacklers is still on the wall. Philip Morris's name is on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Variety of very toxic sponsors, in other words, are bringing in a great deal of money. One of the paradoxes for those of us who live in New York is that something like the Roosevelt Monument, we own it, we paid for that. That's actually a city monument. It's very expensive. Was paid for by the city. So we're kind of watching the American Museum right now because they've said that they're going to remove the statue from outside, and yet it's still very much there.
Yeah.
And obviously it's a big thing, but it's no bigger than the statue of Robert E. Lee that was removed from Richmond. And then if you think, well, if you're not willing to change the small displays inside, you're not willing to open the glass. And in one case, I want them to just turn an object around so you can see it properly, but they won't because of this. Then are you really going to go and remove this thing? It may have something to do with the fact that Theodore Roosevelt IV is on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. Who knows? It's just a very extraordinary place, but it has had this enormous impact because it's so centrally an educational institution. Millions of New York City school kids were taken through these galleries, and they had very explicitly racializing galleries that they've now taken down, thankfully, that would indicate a kind of the literal hierarchy of the history of man through the skulls, the way that I showed you. And they had a particularly perverse theory of evolution where humans were not at all connected to human-like creatures from Africa. That the American Museum of Natural History believed firmly that they would someday find the true dawn man, they called them, somewhere in Central Asia. And this is actually where genealogically my grandparents are from Central Asia, as it happens. But they sent all these expeditions to Central Asia, and they didn't find anything human. But what they did find was they found fossilized dinosaur eggs, which are fascinating. And these they have on display, and they make a big deal of noise about them. Look at these dinosaur eggs, aren't they great? And so if you are a parent or guardian of young children in New York or anywhere, frankly, in the tri-state area, you end up taking your kids to this museum because they have dinosaurs and they have animals and they have butterflies. And the artist Titus Kaphar, African-American artist, has a interesting and surprising, is what I'm going to say next, interesting TED talk where he talks about this experience. And he took his children to the Natural History Museum, and he's walking in and he doesn't even notice the statue, because that's what big statues of that kind are designed to be denoticed. They do that deliberately, but his kids did. And they, of course, they didn't understand the history of racializing that the statue represents, but they looked at it and they immediately thought it was unfair because the white guy has a horse, but the African guy and the supposed caricature of an indigenous person next to him don't. And that immediately arrested them. I thought, that's not fair. And the museum itself did this exhibition that's still up about the statue. And again, a 6-year-old African-American girl from New York City who's not named says the same thing. She looks at it and says, it's not fair. So that it's actually quite striking the extent to which you realize that the child sees this as it is, but the adult is so accustomed by now to the world that's made by white sight that we don't see it. We walk right past it. And there was a massive Twitter thread around the time of the decision to take the statue down. I read it because I was interested in it, and I was surprised. It's just how often people said, you know what, I'd never noticed that thing. But now I look at it, yes, it's really shocking to me. And so when you go inside, mostly the museum is not going to direct you to these ancient halls of wading birds and so on, but they are going to direct you to the African animals. Mm-hmm. And the elephants were shot by Theodore Roosevelt. They tend not to tell you that. So I mean, it's just the most extraordinary place. And I've long thought that what we actually do need in this country is a museum of American racism. And it occurred to me that actually you could just use the American Museum of Natural History. You wouldn't, all you really have to do is change the sign on the door outside, and you could pretty much use the space exactly as it is. So that's a very long answer to your question, but the Museum of Natural History was really one of my ways in to all of this thinking, both through those activist channels and through the kind of just the mind-boggling nature of what's put on display. And finally, I know I've gone on long about this, it's the second most visited institution in New York, or it was before the pandemic. So that's 5 million people going through that space every year. That's a lot of people. A lot of people, and many of them, majority of them, school children, which is how white supremacy reproduces itself, right? Through institutions.
Yeah. Well, I asked that also thinking about what the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford is doing, where they are radically revising, from what I understand, the way that their collections are organized, the way they're displayed. They're repatriating materials to the cultures from which they were stolen.
Well, this is the I think the key task for those of us who are involved in visual arts is precisely repatriation and restoration and repair. So in the last week, actually, and you can find this on the internet on my Twitter feed, myself and Dan Hicks, who's been writing about the Benin Bronzes, wrote an amicus brief for Tamara Lanier. And Tamara Lanier is the lineal descendant of Renty Taylor and Delia Taylor, who were daguerreotyped by Louis Agassiz in 1850. And these are notorious and infamous daguerreotypes that are owned, as they would say, by Harvard. And Tamara is saying, I would like them back, please. And Harvard is saying, no, you haven't, they have, and you have, get this, no property interest in the daguerreotypes. And so we raised many questions, as you can imagine, but one of the least of which is when Agassiz made these images, there was no copyright law that pertained to photography at all in the United States. Not only that, photography had never been mentioned in a court of law before 1857. Agassiz dies in 1858, and that's when his materials were transferred to Harvard. So he could not have thought he was giving them copyright materials because they weren't copyright. There was no copyright that applied to photography at that time. So you can read the brief, it's 26 pages. But this is the kind of, this then is a, outcome of where the work that I've begun now leads is into saying, what's my obligation as now senior scholar, at least in terms of age, having written the things that I've written and being engaged in the things that I've done, is to kind of, instead of all focusing on another academic publication or another whatever it might be, say, you know what, this was a lot of time, it was a lot of energy to write this thing, it's 26 pages, but that's the best use of my time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I thought she had lost a suit, so she was refiling. Has the suit been refiled?
So she lost it. She lost in what they call in Massachusetts Superior Court, which is actually the earliest level of court. And the pro bono law firm that are handling her case said they always expected that, and that the whole game, if you like, is the appeal.
Got it.
And so it's been interesting. 33 descendants of Louis Agassiz have signed on as an amicus to Tamara, saying, "Would you please give her these things back?" Because I mean, it must be awful to be, to be one of them, and to know that you're kind of, every time your name is mentioned or your family history is mentioned, people go, "Oh, isn't that those daguerreotypes?" And I really, I don't have anything to do with that. And so they're urging Harvard to give them back. When we tweeted this out, Harvard Law School supported us, which was interesting. And so I tweeted at them and I said, oh, so it looks like not all of the institution are convinced by the case that's being made. And they said, damn right, absolutely not. And there's a coalition of students that tweet as Free Renty, and they are trying to do this. What Harvard is afraid of, as they say in their brief, and as every museum says, is this what they call slippery slope argument. And the idea is, well, if you give these back, if you return these photographs, where does it stop? What else do you have to give back? And my answer to that is a great deal, as it happens. It turned out during 2020, as you may know, that Harvard museums have no less than 20,000, I don't even know what noun to use here, items of human remains, almost all of whom are indigenous people from this country, and some of whom are, a small minority of whom turned out to be the enslaved people. So yes, you give all of that back. You give it back right now. You figure out how to give that, of course, right? I mean, but in the case of the American Museum of Natural History, again, they have human remains in there. And they have said publicly, they're not even keeping it secret. These are the most used collection we have in the museum. So at that point, I want to say to whoever's using them, stop it. I don't care what knowledge you think you're getting out of sampling the DNA of these murdered people from a genocide in Southwest Africa in 1906. Stop it. Send them back. If there's no knowledge that's worth that. I believe that. I know other people don't, but I don't think it's worth it. I want to see what happens when, what would happen, and that was in my Liberate Tape meme that they made of, let's say you empty the museum. I mean, you wouldn't, because there are things in there that have an appropriate provenance and that they belong there to an extent. But let's say you did. Then what could we do? Is there nothing that we need space for in culturally, artistically, intellectually? I'd like to run a university that didn't charge a huge amount of money so that students could learn without bankrupting themselves. Now, the national debt of American students is now equivalent to the gross national product of Canada. But one of the things that gets in the way of doing something like that, and there have been efforts to do it in the 1970s in particular, there was a free university in New York, and there was one in London called the Anti-University, and they go broke because of rent. That's always the thing. Mm-hmm. Well, what if a museum said, you know what? It turns out we've given back a great deal of cultural materials. We have all this empty space now. Go ahead, use it. Won't charge you anything. And I'm actually working on a much more small-scale project with Magnum Foundation to use their space as a transition space from the debt machine that we have now to something that will hopefully, for those of you who are students, for your children, it will hopefully be a better future out there. So yeah, I mean, these questions go, they do go very much to the heart of the work that we do. Mm-hmm. But when you start doing that work, you find extraordinary things. And I mean, I recommend to everybody Dan Hicks's book, The British Museums, if you've not read it, which describes how there are 160 museums around the world now that have art that was looted from Benin in 1897. And it seems like it's almost a hallmark of being a fancy museum to have this stuff. It is starting to be returned. Jesus College Cambridge returned some of theirs. The German government are returning theirs. Some other British museums and institutions, but not the British Museum, which has most of it. But eventually, when that wall cracks, then these materials will be returned. There are materials in Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Museum of Art. They have an African collection that was acquired in very shady circumstances in 1923, purchased in the basement of a veterinary college in Antwerp from the concierge of that institution, which, long story short, I think what the Belgian Museum of the Congo, is a huge institution that they have there, just gave them some stuff, but they did it on the DL, literally in this basement. But you will see in Sotheby's catalogs the name of this caretaker, Francois Poncelet, whose job was just to lock the door at the veterinary college, in provenances of African art objects that are sold for substantial amounts of money at Sotheby's and Christie's and other galleries. So in other words, in the most boring, the most conventional, the dullest part of traditional art history, which is provenance, there's crime. There's war crime, there's genocide, there's violence. And that means wherever we're looking in these histories, we're going to find that. That's what my point that I was making today was that, I mean, I didn't show you any officially violent images, but it was a very violent talk. And I don't like that. I'm pro-violence at all. But you're dealing with whiteness, then of course, yes, you're dealing with violence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Allison, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Mirzoeff. Thank you so much for your talk today. I've been thinking about these things since I read Dyer's essay, so it's been a great pleasure to hear what you have to say. I know you have an answer to this, so here's what I'm thinking, and I just want to hear more of what you have to say. In my mind, colonial projects are, have always been patriarchal projects, and the white gaze, of course, is not genderless. So can you say a little bit more about your take on how like white supremacy and patriarchy intersect in these colonial projects visually?
Absolutely. No,
Great.
I mean, thank you for that question, Alison. And so you're calling me to account for not having properly balanced my talk then.
Oh, you're good.
When I show you the figure of Apollo and Daphne, Apollo is raping her. That's his intent. And so when we see the statue of Apollo later as the model of whiteness, as the archetype of whiteness, quite literally, then what we're seeing is that a rapist is being upheld as the model figure for whiteness. African-American scholars and historians have uncovered this vile story of the extent to which women were systematically raped as part of the history of enslavement. And this goes back right to the very first images of the taking possession of America, where a white male figure will stand looking at the naked figure of America, who is a woman, and he takes possession of her. Now that's a very obvious euphemism. And in the history of enslavement, that's particular and peculiar to the United States, which is why it used to be called the peculiar institution. You have this legal get around that's called in Latin partus sequitur ventrum, which means the legal status of the child depends on the legal status of the mother. So that if a woman was enslaved, then her children were enslaved. That was very rarely the case in other histories of slavery around the world. We always hear this thing of like, well, everywhere had slavery. Yeah, to an extent that's true. But there was a very particular form of slavery in the United States that we have to be accountable to. And that was one of the ways in which we have to be accountable to it. So it's increasingly clear to me that, as you rightly say, you cannot separate whiteness from patriarchy, from forms of gendered and sexualized violence. So that's why the strike against whiteness is always and already a feminist strike that has to make visible the invisible space of the domestic. And the domestic is, is the space of violence, whether it is in Argentina, where the strike was first called, or around the world. And if we want to get classicizing about this in the way that, is implied to us by the figure of Apollo, the Greek word oikos means home, but it's also the root word for economy. In other words, then, there is always this question, this imbalance, this gendered and abusive violence. And this, I think, is a second thread that I would want to bring out here, that there is what has remained somewhat less visible is the extent of within this history of violence against children and sexual abuse of children that has now been proved to be entirely pervasive. And in reading recently Stuart Hall's essay about cultural studies that was published in 1983, he says a puzzling thing. He says, go and read the chapter in Capital about the Factory Act. I thought, why on earth is Stuart having me do that? So I did. I went and looked it up. I hadn't read it for many, many years. And it turns out this is a long chapter that is essentially a chapter about child abuse in the factory. And this abuse is the form of making children work 10, 12, 15-hour days without meal breaks, without being able to leave their machines. And the more elite forms of industry, the fashion industry in particular, particularly required children because their little fingers could do certain kinds of detail work on ball gowns and other forms of elite costume that adult fingers were simply too big to do. And this was their explicit justification for why you had to use child labor. And in the vocabulary that is used in the factory reports that Marx collates in this chapter, there's a sentence that stays with me. Marx takes out of the factory report the comment that moments are the elements of profit. Moments are the elements of profit. And moments is, you might remember Facebook tried to launch an app called Moments, didn't really work. Kodak have always kind of advertised themselves as capture the moment. My bloody iPhone keeps telling me, you have a new memory. No, I don't. You just organized my photographs. But in other words, they're still doing this. They're still saying moments are the elements of profit. They're financializing my social media. They're financializing my interactions. And they're doing this in a way that continues to try and exploit every moment of every day. And I mean, the examples proliferate in ways that are just astonishing. Well, the French church was forced to publish a report that showed that 300,000 different cases of sexual abuse and assault in recent time. I'm saying, I don't know if can you hear the NYPD helicopter that's over my head at the moment? So it's very odd because I'm talking to you and you're asking me all these questions. The NYPD have got a bloody helicopter up there, which they've done persistently since Trump lost the election. They just like to, it's a kind of oral harassment that they do in the same way that drones do, because drones are very noisy. They're visually, sophisticated, but then they're very, anyway. I'm thinking about this because a mile or so that way are the Tombs, which is the New York City prison. And it's the prison in which in Bartleby's short story, Melville's short story about Bartleby, that's where Bartleby dies. He dies in the Tombs because he refuses. He refuses to copy. He refuses to participate in the reproduction of capital. He refuses ultimately to eat. Hunger strike, in other words. And in the Tombs right now is a woman called Ghislaine Maxwell. And Ghislaine Maxwell was the accomplice of Jeffrey Epstein. She was his procurer for many years. And she was at college with me when I was an undergraduate in England. And I've asked everybody since that I know from that time, what did she study? And none of us can answer that question because it didn't matter. It didn't matter then, and it doesn't matter now. Nobody knew. But there are then these, these deeply imbricated networks that are not, some of them are history, like thinking about the appalling assault of women on slave ships and of children in factories. But some of them are right now. Some of them are this minute. And I'm just so struck by the extent to which we told ourselves we were making progress, and we believed, I think, at some surreptitious level, that we believed in that idea that I think, President Obama in particular was identified with, that over time things get better. I'm much less convinced about that now, but I'm also convinced that we are having a moment in which it is important and necessary, and just a conversation like this, people are raising these issues so that we're not leaving them to one side in the way that we might have done or we might have not sufficiently addressed, and that we keep coming back to this is the ways that we must think this through. And that's why there has to be a strike. And the strike isn't a withdrawal of labor, because most of us can't withdraw our labor, and even if we did, who would notice? But it is about using our time differently, and it is about asking ourselves, to whom are we accountable? And my friend and colleague François Verche, who's a French decolonial feminist, has asked this supplementary question, which we should all ask ourselves: who cleans the world? And that's literally a question in the sense of who cleans your classroom or your gallery when you leave it. It's also a broader social question of how do we remove the pollution from the world that we have put into it, to the extent that it's boiling in here now because I've got my door shut to try and keep the NYPD out and the general noise of it. And it shouldn't be this hot on October the 21st. It just shouldn't, right? So these all of our problems are, as we used to say, connected. And then that was made very visible, for example, I'm going to finish here because it's a long answer. But at the moment that I had kind of wanted to get in to the talk, that image that I skipped past, which is an image of the disappeared from Argentina. And I put that in, but I wanted to share a story about those photographs, and about how they can be seen and how they were previously invisible and when they might be seen. And it's a long story and I'll shorten it. When I was in Argentina, I went to a dinner that they organized for me on a visit. It was in the before time. And extraordinarily enough, it was in the garden of the house that had formerly been lived in by Evita Perón, as in the musical Evita and all of that, the wife of the Perón, Albert Perón, the leader of Argentina. And so the people in this space, an extraordinary mix of tourists like me, and then there are Peronistas, and some of those are quite left, and some of them very right. And there are people from the former regime. And this woman starts to tell me a story about her sister who had been disappeared. And the story is that her family were somehow connected sufficiently to the regime that she was able to go to a police station and say to a police officer, "Look, my sister has been disappeared. Do you have her?" And instead of saying something like, "Well, we don't do that," they produced a photograph and they showed it to her and they said, "This is her." And she looked at it and she immediately saw that it was not her sister. And she said, "No, it isn't." And so noting parenthetically that the police, in the middle of what's now called the Dirty War, admitted that they killed people and showed her an example of a person who had been killed. After the end of the war, one of the places where people were killed and tortured, called the ESMA, which is in Buenos Aires, and it's an upscale suburb of Buenos Aires, and on the other side of the street from it, these lovely cafes and so on, created into a memory space. And all those photographs that I put on the slide there are posted around the wall of the entrance hall. Many people lost their lives there. And so this woman with whom I'm speaking went to the opening of this exhibition with her brother, and they walk up to the wall and she sees the same photograph of her sister that she was shown in the prison. And she immediately recognizes it as being her sister. And she says to her brother, who had not been there with her, "That's her, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes, of course it is." So there is a way then that under the conditions of state violence, one literally cannot see the people that we love. You cannot recognize them, because you should not recognize them under that circumstance. You should not recognize your sister as someone who has been killed by the state in the offices of the state while those people are still in power. But she was able to, in the space of common memory and of recuperation, of reparation, of reconciliation that the ESMA has become. And it was very important to this woman to tell me that story, and she wanted me to tell it to others, which I've done faithfully ever since. And I think that's why I think, you know, we have an obligation to all of these victims. And, you know, statistically, just looking in the Zoom room, there'll be someone or several of us in here who've been through gendered and sexual violence over the years. To not forget that and to make it a present part of the work that we do. So that's, again, a long answer to your question, but it was not a small topic that you raised. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, it was fine. And I appreciate the examples very much. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to ask a quick question. I know we're running a little bit late here, but if you don't mind answering this, I'm curious what you would think about the role of social media. I know this is like a very weighty question, but the role of social media and serving as almost like a digital counter public. You know, we receive so much information, such as the murder of George Floyd. It was broadcast on social media. Some people chose to watch the video, some people chose not to, but those images were widely shared and widely available. And then even if you didn't see the actual video, all the, like the examples of the mural you showed, and people were taking it upon themselves to paint and to draw and to continuously share photos. So I wonder about the role of, again, social media as almost like a digital counter public, and that do you think it can serve as an opportunity for marginalized groups to almost perform their own version of surveillance upon the state when they are normally the ones that are being surveilled upon? Hopefully, does that potentially lead to any monumental change in accountability?
Thank you for that question. I mean, obviously, you know, you've answered it, I think, to a considerable extent. It's clear that as corrupt as social media are, and we all know the answers to how, and I think they're getting worse. Nonetheless, all of the major social movements that we can think of since Occupy have made significant, important use of social media to disseminate and share their message. And Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag. In Argentina, ni uno menos, not one less, is a hashtag. If we think of the murder of George Floyd, you have to think, as to a certain extent, the infrastructural conditions that permitted that possibility of us rising up against it. Darnella Fraser, 17, she had a smartphone that had sufficient capacity to make a video that's 9 minutes and 26 seconds long, which wouldn't have been the case 10 or 15 years ago. That she had a data plan that allowed for her to post that video, which wouldn't have been the case 5 years ago. And that there were enough people out there using devices with that capacity to circumvent the initial attempt by the Minneapolis Police Department to propagate a totally false narrative of what happened to George Floyd, as they always do. So I think we have to kind of have, on the one hand and on the other hand, kind of approach to social media, if you like, that they have been indispensable to every social movement, but that they are policed and they're surveilled and they are monetizing operations. And we have been able to use them against themselves to an extent. And I think people have migrated to Signal and to Telegram and to other such platforms. I've spent a great deal of time on this platform over the past year, talking to people, not just in the United States, but around the world in autonomous learning spaces. And I can't deny that there's been an enormous boon to me and to the movements that I've been participating in as much at the same time. And I'm knowing that Zoom is generating great revenues, mostly from institutions like yours and mine. But they're also gathering data from all of us. This, though, I think we want to see in the long term. So there's a essay that I go back to very often by Nick Couldry and Ulis Meijas called Data Colonialism. It's published in Television and New Media. And they, in common with historians of the drone, in common with historians of racial capital, in common with historians of whiteness, see this as a long history. But the history of big data, the history of the accumulation of data, is one that begins not with the invention of the internet, but with the expansion of Europe in the 15th century. So someone like Simone Brown will talk about biometrics as having their origin in the descriptions of the enslaved that were registered into the ship's logbooks on the way across the Atlantic, because they couldn't speak the languages, they didn't know their names, so they're making mediocre visual descriptions of people. We continue to have distinguishing marks as a category on our passports. That's a direct legacy of the history of visual definition of the enslaved. So my answer to your question then is to say that, of course, but we want to zoom out a little bit and say the social media are merely the latest instantiation of a colonization and of racializing surveillance capitalism that is now 500 years old. But that we are also finding, and we continue to find, ways to find the holes, to find the tears in the projection of whiteness that has been done over 500 years, whether in the narrow window or in the broad frame. And those are spaces in which we can live, the spaces in which we can create communities of care, and spaces in which we can create a different understanding of what it is to be social, and make instrumental use of the things that they try to dangle in front of us. You have to, I think, just be very self-conscious about it and say that, keep your eye on how long is this, how long am I using it, and at what point does it start using me more than it's worth it? We will probably start to get to a point, and I think we may be there, where the so-called free internet is more corrupt than it's worth. So that we may need to return to a model that's both a much older model in terms of print culture and an older model in terms of the internet, which is the paid subscription. And I'm not interested in paying a subscription for Netflix or whatever else. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the sustaining of the possibility of alternative views, different content. You know, it's difficult in the way that Twitter and Facebook now filter their news feeds for me to share open access information. I could do that much more easily. Around the time of Occupy, I had a blog. I did a durational writing performance where I posted something about Occupy Wall Street every day for a year. And I created the audience for that through Facebook and Twitter. And by the end of it, 40,000 people a day were reading that. If I was to do it now, I would have to do it through some different kind of platform. It wouldn't attract attention through Zuckerberg-controlled media, right? But that's not surprising. I mean, it's a long hegemonic game. Antonio Gramsci wrote around the contestation of culture, and Stuart Hall's writings are all about this. It's a tactic that we're using here. I don't think we will succeed in the goals that we've been setting out tonight if we insist on a kind of purity. It's easy to be pure, but they usually tend to be by yourself in doing it. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but I think it's a tactical one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a topic that recently discussed in a class of mine, and just the many pros and cons that a lot of that you just covered as well. And yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but like most things, it's there's a lot of gray area, and Yeah. Well, I think, we're running a little bit behind. Do we still have time, Dr. Mirzoeff, or it looks like Caleb has a question. Not sure.
Hello.
Caleb, you have your hand up. Go on, man.
Cool. Thank you. So I know you talked a little bit about direct action earlier, specifically with the statues, and how I talked about the the prominence of social and national media. But would you be able to talk about the rhetoric against direct action specifically, and how it's like prominence impacts future revolutionary movements, like calling them riots and everything like that, using specific negative terminology to describe them?
So I'm not quite clear what you're asking. You're saying negative viewpoints about direct action?
Yeah, so like national the usage of negative rhetoric against direct action from like social and national media. Does that make sense? Like how they use it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's been interesting, hasn't it? Because there's always this argument against doing anything. You should always wait. You should always try and do things a little more moderately. I was reading the other day one of Stuart Hall's essays from 1982, in which he ends with this sort of blast against people who say, be more moderate, move more towards the center, don't try and create any noise, do things incrementally. We've done that in the interim. It's often been done, but what's actually brought things about is direct intervention. So I mean, I go back here, I think, in this question of statues that you mentioned. BYP 100 in Durham, North Carolina, pulled down a Silent Sam statue just a few days after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. And what was interesting about that action was that people were arrested, but everybody there said they had participated in it. Nobody tried to deny that they'd been, so they ended up arresting a huge crowd of people. They couldn't figure out how to charge anybody. And in the end, they didn't end up charging anyone. And I think the bringing down of that statue kind of broke a kind of aura around those things. I think again of, in Britain, for example, the statue of Edward Colston, my brother lives in Bristol and he knows that that statue is up in a Black British neighborhood. It's been hated for many years. And eventually people just got up and they picked it up and they threw the thing in the sea. Now that gesture wasn't just a taking it down, that was a performative gesture that told you something. It told you something about the loss of life in the transatlantic slave trade. It told us about what Derek Walcott says, that the sea is history because so many people lie on the seafloor, that the abyss is a space of human loss. And it taught us that history. And, immediately they went and they fished it out and they put it on public display, and they assumed that what people would say is that they wanted it to go back up, but they didn't. They didn't want to see that thing. Now, the official policy of the government is now retain and explain in Britain. Keep the statue and put a little plaque on the side. That's obviously ridiculous. But what I think now is happening is that we can think of, there's a range of possibility of direct action. We talked about this in terms of restitution of cultural property. The ukukor, which is in English a cockerel that was just returned to Benin from Jesus College, Cambridge. The reason that happens, a group of students got together and protested that their college had it. And they kept doing it from 2016 to the present. So that's 2 or 3 generations of students. They kept that dialogue going. And the universities will always try and say, well, let's have a discussion. Let's have a standing committee, do a report. And then hopefully the generation of students that has raised the issue will have graduated, and then nobody really reads the report, nothing happened. Well, they stuck with it. At the national level, which I think you're asking about as well, one of the things I was very struck with if we think about this is connecting some of the themes that have just been brought up by Alison and by others. The history of the indigenous schools in Canada, when that became clear that many of the children there have been killed and buried in these appalling grave sites, Indigenous activists then went and they picked up the statue of Captain Cook and they threw it in the sea. And it made sense. Everybody knew what they were doing. It wasn't like, well, why are they doing that? It's been clear to everybody what we're doing now. And if you go back to the suffragette action that I spoke about in 1912, what they were asking people as they sat down, how much jail time are you able to do? So if you couldn't, for whatever reason, go to prison for a significant amount of time, you'd be asked to just break a small window. But if you could, you'd be asked to break a larger window. So that means that then that there's not a single way to do direct action. There are many, many ways to do direct action. And it's the combination of them that produces social change. The change that I've seen in the course of the last, 20 years, let's say, is that when the global justice movement that began at Seattle in 1999 occurred, I think the almost universal expression across national and political media was, who are these crazy lunatics? This is appalling. And David Graeber died just a year ago now. But I think we've seen in the course of that 20-year period that whatever people's political position on the anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-home, all of the antis side of things, that there has been a consensus that if you want to make some form of social change, you will need to take it outside of the halls of representation and into some form of direct action. And that's a real change over the course of the last 20 years. And, my friends who are terribly concerned about electing more Democrats, and then you have to look at the mess that's currently going on where they can't agree amongst themselves what to pass. And it looks likely that we'll have to, in 2022, we'll be back fighting over white supremacy in Congress again. And we're likely to need to learn from our Argentinian comrades and from our Mexican comrades and from our Irish comrades about how to restore reproductive rights in this country. Because again, we've fallen into this kind of comfortable pattern of assuming in the way that our legislators say to us, well, that's an established right, that's given law, they're not going to change that. Well, they did. So we're going to have to figure out a different way to do this. I think people are, so I think that clamor that comes from the media is less influential than it was. And the other thing I think that we have to think about a little bit is the insurrection of January 6, 2021, because we saw a kind of very curious sort of fascist appropriation of what had been some of the rhetorics of direct action. I wouldn't see a group of anarchists using the level of violence that those people used. I mean, that just wouldn't, I don't know, any anarchists are not violent like that, despite the name. And yet there has been this kind of contamination, if you like. They use some of the chants, whose streets are streets. They use that. The police used that chant in St. Louis against Black Lives Matter demonstrators after the murder of Michael Brown. So there's a contestation even around that idea, around the idea of direct action. And there's no doubt, to my mind, that we are in an extraordinarily polarized time. I mean, it's really not like any period I've lived in before in that regard. So that we will have to keep asking ourselves these questions.
Thank you.
I think so this might be a point, having gone onto the very grand political scale there, this might be the point to love you and leave you.
Yes.
I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to go to a bar and set the world to rights now, but I hope you all do that wherever you are.
Thank you so much. This was so fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to really answer questions too. It's really been a fantastic opportunity to have you virtually with us here at ISU.
My pleasure.
So thank you again so much. And yeah, thank you all as well for coming. There will be information coming out soon about the next event in the speaker series, the Experiencing Image speaker series. So please keep a lookout for that. But thank you again, Dr. Nicholas Mirzoeff. We really appreciate having you here. So thank you.
Thanks. I've enjoyed talking with you all this evening. Thanks for staying so late. I appreciate it. And best of luck with the rest of your series.
Thank you.